Dr. Ferst drove 100,000 miles across 4 continents and over 14 expeditions, searching out churches, cathedrals, baptistries, catacombs, archaeological sites, art galleries, antiquities museums, necropolises, classical gardens, castles, fortresses, palaces, and private homes, all in search of sarcophagi. Yes, it's the true story of one man's journey, along with his adventurous wife, to document the approximately 2,000 presently existing Roman Empire sarcophagi. And trust me, he ended up with some fantastic stories. Hello, this is Anya Leonard, founder and director of Classical Wisdom. You are listening to Classical Wisdom Speaks, a podcast dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds. Today I'm talking with Barry Ferst, professor of ancient philosophy, Islam, philosophy and culture, epistemology, and the philosophy of art and beauty at Carrol College. Today we discuss his book, Stone Sarcophagi of the Roman Empire, and the amazing journeys he embarked to create it. But before we begin, a quick thank you to our Classical Wisdom Society members who make this podcast possible. If you would like to become a society member and help support the classics, please go to classicalwisdom.com and click Start Here. Now, on to the quest for sarcophagi. To be honest, it sounds like it's such a niche category, sarcophagi. And you're not the first person I've met who really loves them. So I think it's really great to kind of understand these sort of specialty realms, but actually they're more than just specialty because, I mean, people always die. It's something we have in common with the ancients. And the concepts of how we come to understand death and what we do in the afterlife, these are really important elements that really reveal a lot about individuals and societies. So I think sarcophagi are pretty cool. That's
okay, good. Good.
And you have traveled quite extensively in search of sarcophagi. You've had this really kind of cool mission that I think about finding as many sarcophagi as possible. But I think maybe a good place to start is to just sort of give everybody a recap on what exactly is the sarcophagus, how it was used, how it was made, sort of the one-on-one on how they worked.
Okay. About 150 AD, the Emperor Hadrian, the Roman Emperor Hadrian, was traveling through the old lands of Greece, what we call Greece, and he saw these beautifully carved caskets for the dead. And these were made of stone, various kinds of stone. For the wealthiest people, these caskets were made of marble. And so he became very interested in these and brought the idea back to Rome. What a sarcophagus is generally, think of a big stone block about 5 feet in length, about 3 feet in depth, and about 3 feet high. So imagine a stone block like that, a marble block. Then the center of it, the insides are hollowed out, are actually carved out. And to make a bed on the inside for the deceased. And so you have this large stone block, and the inside is hollowed out from the top. The body is put in, and then a lid is made, again, of marble, if you're wealthy. And the lid is fastened to the casket itself with what passed for tar to seal it. And many of them had lead clips on either side to hold the lid on. And so that was a funeral casket or a sarcophagus. And the fancy name is lithos sarcophage. And lithos means stone, obviously, stone. Sarcophagus is, to quote Lewis Carroll, a portmanteau word. It's put together, so sarx, S-A-R-X, using Latin lettering, means flesh. Phagus, the second part of the word, means to eat. So you put the body inside and the flesh was eaten. I mean, it came back a year later, all you had was bones. Okay. Some of the boxes were actually lined with a material that would speed up the eating of the flesh. So lithos, sarcophage, sarcophagus. These were made by the Romans, and since they're in stone, they are not like the Egyptian ones. The Egyptian sarcophagus was made of wood and cartons, like paper, like cardboard, not exactly, but different. So I focused on these that were made of stone. They were made from approximately 150 AD or CE to about 450 CE.
That's a long time.
And the reason they stopped being made, they didn't really get stopped, but many fewer were made, many fewer. It's because this is the end of the Western Roman Empire. And so things were collapsing. People didn't have the money. The actual industry collapsed, which I can talk about. But anyway, they're called sarcophagi. And some of them are very beautifully carved. Some are carved like billboards for the person's faith. So we can read them and see what that person who was put inside believed. And so we get this mythos, the cult image or the religion. You can use whatever word you'd like here. And that's fascinating. Plus the carving is actually, many of the boxes are done quite beautifully. There are also sort of off the rack boxes where you would simply go in like today and they were carved waiting for you and you just buy them. Others were made very specifically to the orders of the person who would be passing away or the family. Others had almost no carving at all on them. Some were actually just bare. And so that's what I went after, were these.
Just as a logistics question, and I don't know why I'm so curious about this. One, did they ever put pillows or blankets in there for them as well, or are they just straight on top the stone?
If you look on the inside, the carving on the inside is flat, and then there's a stone pillow to rest the head. So the head would be elevated maybe 4 inches. So it would look like a bed in stone. If there was fabric placed in there, to the best of my knowledge, I can't think of any of the boxes, any of these caskets that still have fabric.
Yeah, they wouldn't last, would they, surely? 2
things. A, it wouldn't last. Fabric only lasts in very, very dry conditions. The body, of course, as it deteriorated, would be anything but dry. But the second thing is that most of these boxes, I have to go back. The boxes weren't buried. It's not like today. The boxes were either placed on the sides of the road, the main road into town, so people would actually see them.
Wow.
If you've seen the funny movie by the Coen brothers, Hail Caesar, the opening scene actually has the Roman soldiers walking by these sarcophagi. It's just wonderful that they had a historian that knew. So these sarcophagi would be placed on the roadsides. You would see them as you walked into town, or they'd be put in mausoleums, small buildings, and the sarcophagi would be placed inside, but they weren't buried. So What that meant was, over the centuries, they were robbed. The lids were pried off, the bones would be thrown out, and any jewelry, fabrics, gold would be taken. And so of all the sarcophagi that I have seen, maybe 10 of them still had the bones in them and a
Wow,
little jewelry. All
that's
that was
amazing.
gone. Yeah, would have been stolen. So as far as fabric or anything, that's non-existent, again, to the best of my knowledge.
Yeah, I was going to ask, when you said they put the sort of the red clips on, if they put the clips on so that they could open it, because you said, it took about a year. Were they checking in on the bones, or is that just when somebody went to rob it, they'd realize?
Yeah, various reasons. One would be robbing it. But secondly, they were often opened and another member of the family would be put in. So a husband might die, or the wife might die. Generally, women died first. Because, the average age was 28 years of age for a woman.
The
That didn't mean that some
childbirth
women,
mostly.
what?
Childbirth, I imagine, is
Yeah, childbirth. Childbirth, what was a major cause. It didn't mean that some women didn't live long, but you still had your average was down around 28. Anyway, so a beloved wife might die, and the husband would take another wife, would have another wife. This was just standard. But at some point when the husband died, the lid would be opened and he would be put in.
So to speak about sort of what the sarcophagi meant to the people, was it just sort of a resting place? What do we learn from the sarcophagi themselves, and about both from the people and about the mythologies? Like, what can we learn basically?
Quite a bit, and a great variety of things. So from some of the carvings, we know that some of the upper class Romans, or upper middle class, what we might call that, the equites, which were like the knights, some people were very secular. And so the carvings would be meaningful to these people, and the carvings would be something about their household. So I'm thinking of one very beautiful box that simply shows a stable with the owner's favorite horses. So absolutely nothing to do with religiosity, but he wanted to memorialize his favorite horses. And we actually carved the names above the horses of who they were. So there were some few boxes where we know the people were quite secular. And if they believed anything, they were probably Stoic, followed Stoic philosophy or Epicurean philosophy. And both these philosophies really didn't have much of a vision of an afterlife. The Epicureans denied an afterlife. Okay. We have other boxes in which we can tell very clearly what the religious outlook was. And the religion of Bacchus or Dionysus or Liber, I can use all three names, are very prominent. So when I began this, I found scholarly books that said we have 20 of these boxes of Bacchus or Dionysus. In my research and in my photographs, I've turned up over 90 of these books, which says that it was a very, very popular religion during this period of 150 to 450. In fact, it was probably more popular than Christianity. And in one of my books, Sunday School Sins, I talk about Christianity picking up some of the iconography of Bacchus. So I can tell by the number of surviving boxes who these people were, how important this religion was to them. some of the boxes dealt with a particular mythological character or religious character that we might. So we find a lot of boxes that have Achilles on them, the story from Homer's Iliad. And so the question is, why would this person, these people, select that story? Why would they select the story of Achilles killing Hector and Priam or Priam coming and begging for his son? So it becomes a question. What was in the person's mind to order this box, to have a box like this? Lastly, we find boxes made in the mid-3rd century. And these particular sarcophagi show military events. And we can tie that too, in the mid-3rd century, as you know, Roman emperors, some of them lasted all 24 hours. It was a very militant time. The empire almost fell apart. You know, if it hadn't been people like Diocletian being able to hold it together, the whole thing would have fallen 200 years earlier. So some of the boxes point out that this person was a general. This person, you know, served in the army. My point being, there's a variety of things we can learn from the boxes, more than just religious.
Yeah, I imagine that it's in death, in your what you want to immortalize on your casket, that you would really represent some of your core beliefs.
It's correct. It's correct. And again, this span all the way from secularity through the religious billboard kind of thing, which is great on the Dionysian or Bacchus boxes. The development of stories that we see in Christianity. So a variety of things. And again, some of the boxes are, like I say, just off the shelf. You know, they have some rosettes on them, some bowers, and that's all. The most touching boxes that can bring tears to your eyes are the ones that have a plaque, a tablet, and they're carved with a very meaningful thing. A father writes about the loss of his son or daughter at 10 years of age. How beautiful she was, how handsome my son was, and what we thought would happen. And these can be very tearful. Really give you insight, humanity.
Yeah, it's beautifully put, and it is amazing that also I think probably in societies that had a lot more pre-literate population, imagery, the importance of telling stories and having symbols on there give information would be much more important than maybe we might think of today.
Exactly. And we know that from the great cathedrals that have so much imagery. I'm trying to remember the great cathedral in the center of Rome, Santa Maria. I can't remember the whole name. Beautiful, from the 5th century, beautiful mosaics telling the whole biblical story. Because you're right, people didn't have the literacy to read. And this was carried on, of course, through the medieval period and Renaissance. So yes, pictures played, iconography played a very important role.
I once was at the Walters Art Museum, I think I wrote to you, in Baltimore, and they have just an amazing collection of sarcophagi there. And I was going through the room with the curator, Lisa Anderson Zoo, and she was, you know, telling me all the different sarcophagi and explaining it. And one of them showed a woman dying in birth, and it had Zeus there with the thunderbolts. And I said to Lisa, I was like, oh, I bet she died of preeclampsia. And she said, oh, what do you mean? I was like, well, preeclampsia is actually ancient Greek for lightning strike. So you might have the exact way she died, even telling you on the sarcophagus.
On the sarcophagus. Yeah, it's tremendous reading them and reading the details that are on them. and some are very illuminating. I wish we would do more. We don't do much in this country, but your story reminds me of, we've been to Pompeii several times, and I keep using we. My wife is Louise. Louise also has a degree in philosophy, and her interest, we travel a great deal. She's a great traveler. She goes to places I'd be scared to go, but we go. She is very interested, or has been very interested, in pre-medieval gardens. And so we search these down and look for mosaics. It's taken us to Eastern Turkey. It's taken us to Cyprus, and so on and so forth. So that's the we that I'm referring to. On some of our trips, we would take our 2-year-old daughter. By the time my daughter was 13, she said, "Dad, I don't want to keep going to museums. I want to go to discos." So she now goes herself. Dad promised her he'd pay for airfare wherever she wanted to go. So she travels separately. Actually, one of our great scares was being in Syria. She was 2 years old. And in Syria, every so many miles, soldiers would come out with submachine guns looking for money. And that was a very scary time. But there were things, I had to go out to Palmyra. And so we did have to go. And again, my wife's quite tough. And so she kept us going. But those were some of the more scary kinds of things. Can I hold something up?
Yes, please.
Can I hold my book? Is that okay to show my book?
Of course. Yes, I'd love to see it and to show everyone.
So this was the culmination. I think you can see that. This is the culmination of 20 years of work. And you can see, maybe the picture shows it all. There's the stone box, and there's a body in it. And you can see the lid in the back. And actually, this picture is from a video that is shown in Marseille at their new museum in Marseille, France. That museum has about 6 or 7 sarcophagi. And so they let me have this picture. I shot it, and then I got rights to the picture. And then this, I think you can see it. I'm standing with sarcophagi where sarcophagi were actually cut. So I said the word marble. The word marble comes from the Sea of Marmaris. And there's an island in the Sea of Marmaris that's almost all marble. And that's where the word comes from. So we went out to this island to see this sort of open air museum. These are sarcophagi that are still sitting there because they never were used. Things got bad. And they just sat there for 2,000 years. So I think you can see this picture. Anyway,
it's fascinating.
This is the tome of sarcophagi.
Well, I think maybe we should back up just for a second to kind of illuminate a bit what your mission was, so that everybody kind of can catch up. Because if I understand correctly, you kind of had a goal to find all the sarcophagi that you could and to photograph them. So can you tell me maybe how many sarcophagi you could estimate there were and how many you were able to find?
In 1984, with a position secured at a college, my wife and I decided to take a grand tour of Europe, the old 19th century grand tour. And so we spent 13 or 14 weeks. I always lease a new car. It's a special deal. And we traveled around Europe. We flew to Moscow and St. Petersburg and so on. And I saw a couple of these boxes, these sarcophagi, not really knowing what they were, but quite beautifully carved. There's 3 or 4 in L'Ermitage, the Hermitage in St. Petersburg, Leningrad at the time. But when we returned home, thinking this would be our only trip, I said, this was wonderful. Let's go again. And so we ended up traveling, I'd said, to Europe, sometimes for 4 weeks, sometimes for 8, sometimes for 10, approximately every 2 years, 2.5 years. By 1990, I had seen enough of these sarcophagi that I became very interested in them. I have a background in art. And so not only do I know about the classical world because of my studies, I also dabble in art. My father was trained as an architect, as a draftsman, and so on. He said, if you're going to be educated, you should know something about art. And so I also delve into art. And so by the 1990s, I began book researching this material. And I came across in several of the scholars, mainly German scholars, that the work on sarcophagi, the official work on sarcophagi, the academic work on sarcophagi started in 1880. And a corpus was made from 1880 to about 1910, 1915 by 1 or 2 German scholars, what they came across, but the First World War put an end to that. And the material sat roughly until the late 1960s. In the material that I read, it said there were 20,000 sarcophagi.
Wow. It's a lot.
Well, how am I going to track down 20,000? So I went back to the first writings from the 19th century. And I realized that a mistake had been made by later scholars. The 20,000 represented not complete sarcophagi or complete front panels that had all the beautiful carving. It represented those complete sarcophagi, but also fragments that were in museums. And I wasn't interested in fragments. I mean, some fragments are all this big. I'm interested in full sarcophagi or the front panel. And as I did more research, I realized that the number that was always quoted was the 20,000. But it was really more like 2,000 of complete sarcophagi or panels. And 2,000, believe it or not, I thought I could get and that goes back to my personality and my wife. We don't stop. You understand, we don't stop. We're people who produce a lot of things. Okay. Well, I thought 2,000 would give direction to our trips. Maybe I can get 2,000. All right. And was an impetus. And so before we would take a trip, I would spend a year to 15 months setting up every single day where we would be, who I should meet, and what food to eat, what wines to drink. We're very interested in these kinds of things. What museums to go to, what archaeological sites to go to, what churches to go to, so that when we would leave, I would know day to day. We'd fly into Nice, France. I love Nice. We'd fly into Nice, France, Paris, whatever it was. There'd be a car waiting for us, and off we would go. We'd always lease a brand new Peugeot because we'd be going to places where I had to have a very good car. Go to Algeria, for instance. I had to have a car that I knew was going to take me where I needed to go. We'd load the car with wine and bread and cheese and sausage and simply go. And day to day. Some places I had to have letters of introduction. So this was be prepared for me. Passes to get into certain places and so on. And so I was interested in what the carvings would tell me about the people from 2,000 years ago. It gave me an access to popular culture rather than academic culture that was in my philosophical training. I teach Greco-Roman philosophy and culture. And so this gave me an access into popular mentality, these boxes. Secondly, art, the construction of these boxes in the sense of how the figures were made and carved, so on and so forth. Later boxes, for instance, used drilling to make eyes and so on. And so it fit a lot of things that I was interested in, that my wife was interested in, plus the excitement of traveling. You know, it's exciting traveling in Algeria or Syria or, you know,
Oh yeah.
Morocco.
And I got to say, the more out of the way places you go to, the more magical the experience is, because there's nobody there. You know, like you go to the Parthenon and you're competing with a gazillion people and their selfie sticks. But I remember once going to the Butrint in Albania, and I'm like wandering around, and hey, I've got it to myself. I mean, this is like Augustus's, you know, holiday home, and there's no one there. And so every time you just take that little bit of a brave step to go outside of the usual track, and you're so rewarded for it. So rewarded.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, the stories that you can tell, it's almost like, you know, Odysseus and his stories. Again, we were at, I don't remember exactly, I think it was Algeria, and we're somewhere in the backlands looking at a waterfall, and a young girl comes up to me. I had cut my hand a little bit. So we always carry our own medical supplies. When we go to these areas, I carry a toolbox for the car. I carry medical supplies. So I was putting some salve on my hand, and this little girl comes up to me. She's about 8, 9 years old, and she points to her ear, and she has some sort of infection. So with a glove, I put some of this antibiotic on her ear, and then she opens her shirt, and it went all the way down her side. But I'm saying, you know, these are the types of experiences you have. You know, I left the salve with her. I showed, you know, this kind of thing. In Syria, we ended up in an archaeological dig on a temple of Astarte, and they all wanted a picture of us and this kind of thing. So yes, there are all these stories. To get sarcophagi, there were some sarcophagi which were very difficult to get.
So how many pieces did you get all up? How many were you able to find out of the 2,000 that you were looking for?
I've got 1,986.
Wow.
I'm guessing that there are 2,500 at the most. And it has to be a guess because in Assos, Turkey, there's just sarcophagi thrown out in the field. You know, how do I count that? I've got pictures of it. In Split, Croatia, about 10 miles north of Split, the same kind of thing. There's just, you know, 50 sarcophagi thrown out in the field. It was a burial place. So I have a broad picture of it, but I haven't photographed every single one. But yes, I've got 1,986, I think is the number that I was able to get.
That's amazing.
I have a list of some that I know where they are. If I ever get back, I could shoot those. Yeah, I've shot a lot. It's a real corpus that I have. I think Oxford wants to put them in some sort of file they keep. Everything is on a zip. I mean, everything's on my computer. There's a website. Everything's on a zip drive that I send to a few people that they can have it. I give it away for free. It's a gift to classical art. So that's what developed.
Thank you for listening to Classical Wisdom Speaks. a podcast dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds. Classical Wisdom Society members can listen to the entire podcast with Professor Ferst on classicalwisdom.com. You can also purchase Barry's book, Stone Sarcophagi of the Roman Empire, on Amazon.com.